I'm like an enormous fan of your writing, your work on the page, and also of like, if this isn't weird, although you already know I'm weird, of you personally. Like, just like you have this deep, deep, deep knowledge, um, and this like ability to bring people together and be generous with what you know. And though you write about these really intense, difficult subjects, you're always pushing yourself, it seems, in those like hard directions. Um, you also are just so fucking hilarious. So you make this space and um and of course you write about motherhood because that is the condition of your current
Yeah,
existence.
it really is. It is.
So this podcast is called United Against Silence, this series. It's our collective of brilliant writers that come together and hold this space. And I'm really like interested in how you confront like that pressure to be silent. I think motherhood is so isolating, and there's this idea that like it's not professional to be a mother. Um what do you do with that? Does that happen for you, or is that, am I
Well, I
projecting?
I think that I come from a little bit of a different background and than a lot of writers because I did not start writing till a few years ago. Um, and and I felt like all I was a mother for a very long time. Before I was a mother, I was a teacher, which felt like being a mother to my class every year. I taught kids that were really high need um, and really stuck in poverty and struggling. And so I would be at school for 12 or 14 hours a day. And so caregiving was just what I always did for lots of reasons, both good and bad. I guess not good and bad, for noble reasons, and also like to fill this gaping hole inside me
Yeah.
that I did not know was there, and I did not know how to explore. And I have always been a talker, but I'm not convinced I was always saying a whole lot, you know. So, and I certainly wasn't a writer, and I didn't think I had anything to write. I always wanted to write, and in fact, wrote poetry when I was a kid, as a teenager, but I just didn't. For a long time, I was like, oh well, I'd love to write, but I mean, everyone's already written lots of words. Like nothing I say will be any different or special. And
Right.
then a bunch of maybe, I don't know, I guess it was 2017 now. I auditioned, I guess, for Listen to Your Mother, which to me, I was thinking theater because I had a background in theater, not writing. And so I said, okay, I have this story about a parenting experience that was very, very hard and unusual with a young child relating to mental health. And so I wrote it up in like 10 minutes and auditioned and got accepted to tell this story. And I was thinking storytelling and acting on a stage. I didn't think that I wrote it, but of course I did, right? It was me writing my story. But I wasn't thinking that way. And it went very well as a very hard story that you share. It was the first time I'd done that I had shared something so deeply personal, though I've always struggled with boundaries and often shared things I probably shouldn't share with others, but that was like in front of a huge audience of like 400 people. So I did that, and people were like, "Where can I read your work?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I didn't write after that. But that same kiddo was interested in writing and was refusing to read fiction, and I started writing just fiction for him, and that was actually coming up with hard stuff because I wanted him to relate to it and I wanted him to see people who look like him on the page. So I started writing hard things that were in fiction, and that turned into essays, and those essays sold and were read and caused big feelings of all types in people.
Mm.
And that really sometimes felt amazing and sometimes really made me angry and made me want to write more, made me sad, sometimes made me scared, the stuff people said in response to my work. So I started writing more, and I started realizing that I had a lot to learn, having never like taken one creative writing class in my whole life, right? So here I was in my early 40s and like deciding this is something I think I might want to do. And I started taking class here and there. It was hard with 3 kids, 2 of whom are extremely high need. One of whom is medium high need. And I was home. I wasn't working. I hadn't worked in 10 years at this point, and that was really hard for me because I was starting to be very angry about that.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to admit that. You're not supposed to talk
No,
about
no, you're supposed to be so glad.
anything with
Yeah.
motherhood that isn't self-sacrifice. And
And
I
gratitude,
measured my
so much
worth by
gratitude.
people needing me. And I always had, all people. If I wasn't needed and I hadn't made myself absolutely essential, I thought I just would crash into nothing, right? So I was getting angry and I was getting sad and I was struggling. And so I started really obsessively focusing on my writing and my craft. And I started learning as much as I possibly could and then started working in it, like being a freelance writer and getting paid for this. And it became something that was mine, that was real. But I am a teacher before I'm a writer. I've always been a teacher and I love teaching. I just hadn't taught adults, I'd only taught kids. And I love teaching kids and I miss the classroom. But so I did a couple of volunteer teaching gigs and kept writing and learning. And the volunteer teaching things went really well because I like people so much and I like to help them do what they want to do, whatever that it is. Whether I used to be a running coach, helping them, people who'd never run before, train for a marathon, people that thought they could never run because of their weight or their health background, like learning how to do that. So I just would teach anybody anything that I knew because I just love to teach people. And
And you do it in such a clear, like, okay,
sometimes I try
in
to.
my experience,
Sometimes I get very excited.
there's a real like trained, like, okay, there's clarity in the way that you,
Well, I believe in pedagogy. I believe that I've had teachers and my kids have had teachers, and I've even been this teacher when I didn't know what I was doing, that really thinks that just knowing about something is enough to teach. But really, you have to think about your class and who's in it and why you're teaching it and what they want out of it versus just content. I'm not a professor of calculus. I'm Everything I teach is about writing somebody's own story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, no matter what, even pitching. When I talk about freelance work, is the story they want to write for a publication they love. I don't teach fluffy things in writing, and I don't, not that there isn't a place for it, because I've written some fluffy things, but I mean, that's not what I teach really. And when I work with clients, I work one-to-one to do stuff that they love and want. That's what they want to become good at and what they want to be successful at. So that's what I do. And that came back to parenting again. And, what you talk about, you have to be vulnerable if you're going to ask people to be vulnerable too. I started editing a couple of literary journals, and here I was demanding from my clients and the people that were submitting that they were honest and that they weren't beating around the bush. And I was a bit of a brutal editor. I'm like, nope, lies, lies, lies. Tell me the truth. Tell me the truth. Why are you tap dancing? Give me the goods. And I'm very blunt, which I try to be kind about it, but it's hard sometimes to hear someone accuse you of not being totally truthful in
oh
your work.
yeah.
And if I'm going to demand that from people, then I am going to have to give it too, right? So I started just talking about motherhood a lot and started talking about identity a lot. And it was very uncomfortable. It became less and less, oh, my kids' experience, which is what I started, because that was, even though it was really upsetting to write about, it was their experiences that I was writing about. And I started to recognize the problematic nature of that, and focus, not that those experiences don't come into my writing, but I started to talk more and more about my experience within that
Right,
relationship and those
right.
experiences. And that's a lot harder. And it takes a lot more courage to do.
Mhm.
And so as I was doing that, and it's a muscle, being honest is a muscle. So
For sure.
learning how to recognize your own bullshit is a muscle, right? And you spend your whole life training yourself to be polite. And I still believe in good manners, but like in art and in advocacy, it's not about that. It's about just putting it out there and being courageous and talking about the stuff nobody wants to talk about. There are already 10 million essays about moms who love their kids so much. Of course, I love my kids so much. I would jump in front of a train for them if I had to, but it's much more interesting to read a piece that's complicated and talks about what's really under that. Like,
Right.
so if that makes sense, I think sort of a roundabout way of saying we
Yeah.
have enough lovey-dovey pieces about motherhood. I think it's time to look at what's underneath and
Right. What's
that.
hard. And I was really interested in something you said sort of early on about how with your first pieces of writing, sometimes people made you feel scared and sometimes people made you feel angry, but regardless of what it was, the reaction kept you writing.
Yeah,
That's
I mean, it was hard sometimes because people threatened me about stuff you would never like. I would write about my autistic child deserving to be in the classroom, and get accommodations. So I started writing education more than parenting because I was a teacher and I am a special education or education and disability advocate. That was what I was doing as a volunteer, and then that sort of moved at the same time as writing. That sort of became a thing that I was doing a lot of at the IEP table and helping families a lot. And for a little while, I was doing that more than anything else. But it was very hard. It's emotionally very draining to do that a lot when you have 3 kids who have IEPs and already need so much of that. But people were very upset by my essays and articles that stated that people with disabilities deserved um, accommodations in the classroom, with the assertions I was making that it helped kids without disabilities to be friends with kids with disabilities and to learn alongside of kids with disabilities. That really makes some people very angry. And it was around the same time all this stuff was happening just a couple years into Trump's presidency. So it makes sense looking back that people were acting this way. People have always been extremely ableist and believed in their right to be convenienced, like
yeah.
never to be inconvenienced. People who frequently believe they have that right, but boy, they are very angry and verbal about those beliefs now. Um, Even when the research shows that they're wrong, that in fact their kids will do better in school and be awesome members of society if they are in inclusive classrooms. But no one wants to hear that, right? So people were threatening me, they were emailing me, they doxed me, they told me that I should have aborted my children, that I should be raped, that I should be killed. They were saying these things because I wanted my autistic son to be able to be in a classroom. Like I couldn't believe it, right? And because I was writing on Huffington Post and places like this, and I was writing like some of these essays were personal essays that were like sweet. They were like just about how much I loved my kids, right? And how some hard stuff had happened and we'd gotten through it, and then people were like, you're a child abuser. They were threatening me. They were put my address and say, I'm gonna come kill you. Like it was really nuts, right? And I hate that word. I shouldn't use that word. It was really scary and
With the
shocking.
intention, of course, of silencing you.
Right. And so I thought about I went through periods where I said, I'm not gonna write this stuff anymore. But that actually, on some level, it was cool. It encouraged me to start writing fiction. I would take a break and write a short story. And the goal of the short story would be, it helped me on some levels because it helped me refocus why I was writing. So I wrote a young adult short story about a neurotypical girl and her autistic brother. And I wrote that and it published in Lunch Ticket, and it was so healing for me to write. And it elevated this relationship of this sibling duo. And it was a way for me to highlight many of the gifts of my son, even though it was a fictional story about a much older child. But like, I just thought people just didn't understand that that like there's so many wonderful things about my kids, that they might not see if they don't know them well. And it's so frustrating that people, this was early on in my advocacy, so I was just so shocked by how people were acting toward my own
Mhm.
kids, for example, or toward me. So when I started writing fiction, that brought me back to the purpose of writing, and then I came back to essays and um, really started elevating and highlighting and being more careful with the lines, the line I was walking into whose story was what. So on some levels, it helped me to really reflect on why I was doing it and what pubs I was going to submit to, because I wanted to get, I never got threatened from a Washington Post article. I did get rude comments, but I felt like they were just angry old ladies yelling that I was a bad mom and I could handle that, right?
Right. That's
But
very
Huffington Post stuff, it goes viral or it goes over to Yahoo and oh, you're in trouble once you're on Yahoo, right? So it's that kind of thing. But I am a mouthy girl, and like people on Twitter always do horrible things and say horrible things, and I don't have a lot of followers, but I have enough followers that I get that every day on some level. That's what the world is like now. And I think it's a shame, but it is what it is. So you just stick up your middle fingers and you're like, guess I'm just going to keep doing it. What else can you do, right?
Right.
But I mean, not everyone can do that. And I think that we're silencing people that have really great voices. So it's a bummer.
Yeah.
It's way more than a
Yeah.
bummer.
I think that's absolutely right. There are a lot of, I mean, I honestly I don't know that I could, right? I mean, I find social media terrifying personally.
Well,
Like,
I did ease back on these essays that were really, you know, that were really risky at times. And in the literary world, writing for literary journals, you have a lot more flexibility, which we're going to talk about in the workshop tonight, but there are fewer readers, so you can do things that are riskier and scarier and get practice at it. And that might be one of the reasons that I haven't really been explored, that I went so much more literary in the last year or so, is because it's rare that you get threats from a piece at a literary journal, right?
yeah.
But I have a piece that I'm working on that will come out in the future that is another risky piece in a different area, but I know it's going to reintroduce me to that kind of controversy. And I had to think, it's an education piece, and it relates to going back to school and unions, and it's going to be I haven't done a lot of freelancing lately, and I'm a little bit here and there. And as I write this piece, I'm going, oh, this is going to open me up again to some very angry people. And I just had to decide, am I going to do this? And
Right.
I was like, this has to be done. And I can look back now on the work I did before and said, it really needed to be done. A mom needed to write about how much she adored her autistic kid and how he had the right to live his life. And it wasn't some superhero mom in a cape, and it wasn't some look at me be a great mom, because I am not a great mom, but I fucking love my kid and he is awesome. And I needed to write that piece, that it was hard sometimes, and it was hard for him a lot more than it was hard for me, and that parenting him was like this huge gift. And I needed to write those pieces because that narrative of autism mom was just so awful. And that narrative that I realized was put out there about kids with mental illness was so this bad mom narrative. And I'm just so over all the mom blogs and all the this about moms. So that is how I feel about what teachers are experiencing now too, and the way on the other side of it, parents are treating teachers right now. And so it was time as a mom and a teacher to write that piece.
Yeah.
And so yeah, you might see me on Twitter going, "Oh God," wave the white flag. But I'm sure it's gonna be bad. But that's all right.
But no, but I think that's such an important thing to go into it knowing, like, okay, this one's
Yeah.
gonna be, we're gonna unplug the internet for a few days maybe.
And,
But
I'm so bad at that. I'm like, oh, show me all the comments. I'm like, touch that
you
gaping
read them
wound. It's
all?
terrible. I'm awful. I'm bad. But someone's got to write these pieces, right?
Absolutely,
And I
right?
didn't for a long time. I just wrote like poetry and stuff. So, all right, we're back into it. Let's do it.
But that work you've been doing, your creative work, has been super interesting and
It's been
stunning,
really
and
fulfilling to really look at craft, because when you write freelance pieces, it's just very different.
it's sort
And
of
that is its own
formulaic, right?
craft, but it is somewhat formulaic. And I mean, there are definitely people who are brilliant at it, who can write beautiful, beautiful work for really high-end pubs. But a lot of parenting work tends to sometimes feel this way. And so you have to get to the heart of the story. And I teach classes in that because I think really important stories can get told. But it's harder to be really artistic in that. You're just really about the story in that case, and it's just the action of the story. But as I got into literary nonfiction, which doesn't pay very well, I'll be honest, compared to
You
the
tell
freelance
him.
world, right? Because freelancing can pay pretty well, but when especially not during a pandemic. But that literary flexibility, which we will talk about tonight, is just really magnificent. And you can look at all these different forms, and you can be really honest without trying to learn a lesson. Like maybe this isn't about learning a lesson. Maybe this is
Right.
about this one moment, and it's an ugly moment. And by sharing that moment, someone else looks at that and says, "Oh, me too, thank God." And then someone else is like, "She's awful." And someone else is like, "How dare you say she's awful?" And now we've got a conversation, and it's a different level, um, and has a slower rate of reaction. So it keeps
Yeah,
people
but it
from,
also like maybe assumes more effort on the part of the reader, right?
right.
Literary.
Because if you found I mean, how often does something from even a really great journal, but we're going to read a piece from Pigeonholes tonight. How often does something from Pigeonholes go viral? Like never. Even a really good, wonderful, creative writing outlet is not going to have a million clicks in one day like Huffington Post.
Right.
And I had one of the best editors I've ever worked at for one of my pieces at Huffington Post. I still consider him like up here. And
Mhm.
he cares very much about, you wouldn't think I'd say that about Huffington Post, right? But he cares very much about the story and his writers. And I love that. But so there is art being made even at that level, but it is different
It's
and it is
different because
harder.
you're sort of telling people what to think, right? You're handing them to a
Yeah.
great extent what to think, whereas usually art invites a person, a viewer, a reader to like draw their own
Mm.
conclusions
Well, when you have that many readers reading and responding so quickly in this very immediate way, it is harder to have a conversation, right? When they read my essay on Huffington Post that was about my son's obsessive love for Eminem, I thought this was a funny, adorable story, and I still think it was. But people immediately responded in horrible ways, like and there was no conversation, there was no back and forth. It was like your immediate bias came into play, and I was shocked that people felt this way. But that was, one of my earlier essays. It was very naive of me to think that just because I hadn't experienced these terrible people in the world, that they didn't exist. And so I guess I was just very naive, and it was very eye-opening. But I am going into this new piece knowing it is already super controversial area, and that people I know and care about disagree with me about it. And a lot of that disagreement is fueled by panic right now, and I understand that panic. So I'm hoping that helps me write with a more nuanced lens, because this isn't about a personal situation, and it is something that I can understand both sides. But I am telling them what I think is right, and it's going to be tricky for sure.
well, Hannah, this is the brave shit that changes the world, right? That changes the world, that changes the conversation.
I
So
hope.
grateful. I'm so grateful that you're doing it.
Well, thanks so
And
much for having me and listening to me talk. I appreciate it.
it was fascinating. It's amazing how quickly you've learned so much about writing as you lay out your
I
timeline.
read a lot, and I listen to a lot of writers and editors. It's all out there.
It's all out
I
there.
complain about not having an MFA, and I wish I could afford to go back, but I mean, everything you need is right here, and it's all free on the internet. Amazing work from brilliant, brilliant people, and why not just like soak it all up and learn, right? So
Yes, which is a wonderful, wonderful place to end. Why not just soak it all up and learn?